Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name is Mark Reiboldt, and I'm the host. And today we have another episode talking about a very popular topic that we've actually covered for a number of times over a number of years even, but it continues to pop up. And we're talking about some of the updates and changes recently to coding regulations, policy relating to coding regulations and policies, and specifically some of the changes in E&M codes that are taking place or have already taken place early on in 2023. And so joining me today, I actually have three members of the Coker team joining us, and I want to welcome Jaci Kipreos, and it's her first time on the podcast. And then we also have Matt Jensen and Alex Kirkland joining us as well, who've been on in the past talking about this specific topic. And so I want to dive in. Before we do that, normally I go through all of our kind of housekeeping reminders of where you can find all of our content and stuff that Coker puts out on a very regular basis, which is all very good. This time I'm just going to leave it at if you go to the website at coffeewithcoker.com, you can find all of our content, all of our podcast episodes, white papers, blogs, etc. And there's really good stuff there, and new stuff comes out weekly in most cases. So go there if you want more information on this, or reach out. We'll make sure there's going to be some links and contacts included in the notes to this show if you do have specific questions about this. But with that, I do want to jump right into our discussion with Jaci and Matt and Alex. I think a good place to start, and Alex, maybe I'll let you kick this off, but maybe start with kind of a reminder, or folks that may not be aware, a number of changes in the E&M coding regulations occurred in 2022. Or went into effect, I guess, last January. And there was a number of stuff leading up to that, going back to even, 2020 and prior to that even. But so the last few years, we've seen a number of changes occur. And so last year, or going back beyond that, our team at Coker started putting together the E&M coding calculator tool. And you can find that on our website. You can find that. You can go to cokergroup.com, and it's right there. But it's a really good resource. And it basically, it's a tool that allows you to provide a few inputs, and it kind of gives you a report back that, can hopefully answer some of the questions about some of the changes that are taking place or have taken place. And so with these most recent changes that we're talking about today, we have updated that tool to reflect a number of these changes, the new codes or the new requirements around some of the old codes. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, but Alex, maybe kick us off if you don't mind, and you can probably do a much better explanation of what the calculator tool is and where we're at with it today and how it ties into the overall discussion.
So back in the closing days of 2020, CMS approved their final Medicare physician fee schedule rule for 2021. And the big needle mover that we saw was that those outpatient evaluation and management codes, 9901 through 9915, both for new patients and established patients, those saw big changes in their RVU values. And it happened at a time when CMS was making cuts to the conversion factor, which they've continued to do over the past several years. So we wanted to put together a calculator so that organizations could plug in their volume around those outpatient E&M codes to see what is this going to do to their overall reimbursement. And it's likely that for those specific services, those outpatient E&M codes, they would see an uptick in reimbursement because the increased RVU credit that CMS is awarding to them is outweighing the cut in the conversion factor. What's not shown on that tool is that other services are seeing a decrease in reimbursement because those other services likely did not see an increase in RVU. They likely stayed flat. So there's just the impact of the decreased conversion factor. So we wanted to put together that tool to help organizations understand that reimbursement impact, and also to get the word out that if you don't revalue your rate per work RVU that you're paying physicians, then you're going to be upside down. And so as CMS did this, they had to revalue their conversion factor in order to credit these new incremental RVU values for these specific services. In the same way, healthcare organizations that administer a work RVU based compensation plan to their physicians, they would have to revalue those rates per work RVU that they're paying their physicians. And if you don't revalue that, then you're going to be paying for the non-monetary RVU increase that CMS saw in the changes. It does not consider that other services held constant and that the decreased compensation conversion factor. So we rolled out that tool, and now as we've made our updates, there are maybe 70-ish or so facility-based evaluation and management codes that are seeing changes. There's a lot of crosswalking that has to be done, so we did not update the tool to consider all of those services. Instead, we tried to spotlight some meaningful, where we would expect to see some heavy utilization just to get across the concept of this impact. And it's likely that if you have physicians on a work RVU plan, they're not driving the bolus of their work RVUs from these services. Although if you have primary care providers that are rounding in these spaces, they are likely going to generate some work RVUs from this environment. So we wanted to make sure that we maintained that calculator, still made it a helpful resource for healthcare organizations. But there's a lot more to consider in terms of what the changes that went in place effective 1/1/23 are.
Sure.
And maybe it would be helpful. I know Jaci's on the line, if she could kind of talk us through why CMS was considering some of these changes to begin with, both outpatient and now what we're seeing in terms of the inpatient facility setting, what their overall goals are.
Sure, Alec. So prior to 2021, when we saw the initial change, CMS, along with the AMA, decided it was way time to start listening to providers and do their best to decrease paperwork, decrease the effort of the documentation. That's what really generated the change for 2021. And they started with the office visit codes, those 99201 to 99215, because those are used most often. It was the best place to start. Now they've taken that same rationale and moved it into what you would say the facility or the hospital setting. The big difference here is, and CMS agrees with the documentation guideline. CMS agrees with what AMA did to adjust how we level a service, so to speak, how much documentation is required. The big difference into 2023 is, in addition to the change in the code verbiage, how we level, there's a lot of new guidelines on how to use the codes within AMA. When are these codes appropriate? They've added some more description outside of the code. CMS, along with your other payers, are going to have to make their determination on if they agree with those sort of guidelines. How will they recognize some of these new codes and how they're to be used? From the beginning, CMS agreed with, yes, we believe our documentation standards, what we require of providers, needs to be less burdensome. The big area within the guidelines, the documentation guidelines, the CMS doesn't agree with the AMA, the way that the AMA extends prolonged care for providers. So anyone working within the system, dealing with providers who spend a lot of time with patients, understand that CMS uses different codes for prolonged care. That's the one key area where they don't agree with the AMA on how they brought forward these guidelines. So this year, 2023, one key thing is not just looking at the code descriptors, but going back to your CPT book and looking at the language of how to use these codes and understanding that different payers may have different opinions on that part of it.
So kind of going back to the calculator for a second, to Alex, your point, it is the intention. We want to kind of provide a tool that helps measure the impact of some of these changes, many of these changes. So organizations can go in and literally plug in certain inputs, and they can understand how these specific changes might affect them. What next? I guess, as we record this, it's almost February of 2023. So many changes have occurred. Again, like both of you said, even going back well before 2022. But what are organizations thinking about right now? Jaci, you work with clients both from looking at coding from an audit perspective, but also from an education and setting standards and policies within these organizations. But what would these changes mean right now for our clients, let's say?
One thing that we began telling clients prior to 2023, and we said it prior to 2021, is you've got to get a handle on these code descriptions down, what the definitions mean. So 2 things practices should truly be thinking about right now, if they haven't already. Number 1, if you have a practice that involves hospitalist, or you are heavy on the inpatient side and did not have to consider those 2021 changes, now's the time to dig in and understand if you read the code description, what does it really mean? What does your documentation have to say? The best way to figure that out is to take your 2022 hospital documentation and audit it against the new standards. Are you documenting to that same level? Because you're going to use the calculator to put in numbers from last year, then kind of project forward. Is it fair to project forward if you're not meeting the guidelines anymore? You used to meet the guideline for a 99232. Will you still with the new guide? So you have to take old documentation and see how it fits. Then on the observation side, since they got rid of observation codes, if you have a practice that's heavy or had some observation, not only are you saying I got to change in RVUs because those codes are gone, now I'm using different codes for my observation, you need to see if now can I meet the documentation requirements with the new codes. So you're using that calculator to look at old numbers. However, how are they going to map into the new standards? Then you can use your calculator properly and fairly. I would use it for the first few months, re-audit, see if I'm getting more up to speed, put my numbers back in and be fair about it. Because with some education, they may get up to speed quickly or not.
Yeah, Mark, on our side, Alex and I on the finance operations and strategy side, 2021 was a massive shift for a lot of the work that we do dealing with provider compensation, where you have in the outpatient setting, a lot of the physicians are paid on a work RVU basis. So now going forward with 2023 and some of these more hospital-based codes, a lot of the hospitalists, a lot of the people who will be affected are usually paid on a shift rate basis or a straight salary type basis. So you may not see as much impact on, work RVUs times a rate per work RVU, resulting in more compensation like we did back in 2021, 22. But the changes that we are seeing, they go both ways. They go up and down, and there's change in the conversion factor this year. So the reimbursement that is coming out of these same codes is going to be impacted. So even if your compensation isn't going up dramatically because of the change in work RVUs being multiplied through with a rate per work RVU, there's still going to be an impact on the reimbursement side, and that can potentially put you underwater, or depending on your service mix, maybe have some increased reimbursement.
Yeah, I think about it in terms of 3 different categories of risk that clients need to prepare for. Number one is that I'm a finance guy, so obviously my head goes to the dollars and the reimbursement. But what is this going to do to your reimbursement? Our calculator can help quantify that. And you can run a CPT utilization report and map what the CPT codes are that are going to be billed in this new world, and then understand what is going to be your driving reimbursement for the volume of services that you bill. Is it up or down for what you expect to see? The second category of risk is related to your physician compensation. If you are paying doctors on a work RVU model, are they going to experience an artificial boom because of this? Or is there going to be some mitigating factor that needs to be considered and it's going to disrupt their compensation? Going back again to that CPT level data, you can look at this on a per physician basis to see if your physicians that are on a work RVU plan, how material are their codes that are billed in this area. And from there, you can do an operational review. Are they having an advanced practice provider that's supporting them in these inpatient rounding settings and other things that may jeopardize those work RVUs on a go-forward basis? And then in the other area of risk, I think it goes back to the compliance risk associated with the billing and documentation. Are you running an audit under the where you've billed for these services, where you expect to bill for these services? Are your documentation protocols, is that carrying muster for where the new standards have changed? And so that's what my guidance to clients has been, is thinking about those three different categories of risk. And there's a pretty prescriptive way that you can go about assessing each one of those categories.
And I think that's a really good way to put it, Alex, because it does break it down, because I imagine it's very possible, if not likely, to find a scenario where there's impact, I guess positive or negative, but particularly in this case, negative in all three categories. Meaning, if there's compliance issues, they could stem from things related to how the physicians are getting paid, and obviously there's a financial impact there, not only for the physicians but the organization as a whole. So that I think breaks it down really well. And I think it's also interesting when we talk about, the calculator and understanding the impact. It's one thing to look at that and say, oh, okay, this is the impact, positive, negative, up, down, whatever. But it's designed to only be kind of the starting point for for organizations to get a better understanding of what's really happening in terms of the policy changes and regulatory requirements, but then tying that to how specifically it's going to impact their organization, or even down to individual physicians. Because if you're talking about let's say an employed medical group that's part of a health system, if you can get out on the front end as much as possible as far as information and education to your doctors and APPs, that's going to be obviously far better than having to go at the end of the year and saying, well, there are some changes that went into effect, and now we're starting to see them unfold. So getting ahead of it, I think, is good just from a pure informational standpoint and preparation perspective. But what else and kind of what next? Because again, understanding the impact is only one step. There have to be some changes. And just from what I've heard, us talking in a few minutes and us kind of monitoring these changes, there's a lot of nuance to these changes, right? Whether depending on the type of facility it is, the type of billing. We've talked about in the past, even Alex, to your point, or you kind of alluded to the some changes that went into effect last year related to billing and utilization of APPs. So once they have an understanding of the potential impact, then where are we kind of looking at, hey, here's where the next steps need to occur?
Well, I think it's number one, trying to measure what that impact is. From what I said, pulling the CPT report, trying to quantify those three categories of risk. Once you have that determined, it leaves you to determine do you need to make changes based on how much risk exposure that you're showing? If the answer is yes, then you're going to have to craft that plan forward. On the reimbursement side, if you're showing a deficit, what are other areas where you can make up those revenue shortfalls? And that's going to be from anywhere from contracting strategies with payers to provider production strategies to expense recognition strategies. On the compensation side, does the compensation plan need to be revisited? Are there mitigating forces that need to be reviewed in terms of have you revalued your rate per work RVU for these changes? Do you need to consider any type of stipend for oversight of an advanced practice provider if they are helping support these services? And then how should that be moved forward? And it's going to differ for every organization, but those are the things that we're working with healthcare, with our clients on how to think about this and how to craft a plan forward. It starts with understanding your exposure and then thinking about your feasible alternatives. How should you move that forward? Jackie, do you want to talk about on the billing documentation side of things?
I really cannot stress the importance of really getting a handle of your provider's documentation right now. These new guidelines pose so many challenges in 2021 for our providers, and I foresee, just based on historical information, it's going to pose the same problem. What will make it even more difficult is once that provider leaves the protection of their office and they go off to the hospital, they're in that hospital EMR. And they don't really have an opportunity to change things. So they're trying to fit our new guidelines of documentation into a system that maybe didn't update itself and adapt to that change. And if they are still using older sets of guidelines, things are not going to support these levels of service. So that's something you really got to look at where that documentation is right now and provide that education. The one area we don't talk about a lot because it's such a specialty, and that's the ER. If you've got ER providers, their biggest change was the lowest level now doesn't even require a provider. It's like an office 99211. The RVUs only changed on that 99281. It did not change. It stayed flat on the 2 through 5. But on that 8.1, it decreased. So if they were using 8.1s before, make sure they know it's a different world now. And if they were reporting 8.1s before, it's probably an 8.2 now. So it's those things, it's the little things. For me, when I'm auditing and educating, it's the tinier things, the little things you look for to make sure that you're aware of where your changes are going to hit and how a level of service that met the requirements last year in 2022 that same documentation may not take you to that same level again. And you've got to see where you're going to be.
And Jackie, those even though those small, relatively minor things, right. If it's an issue in compliance, then it's an issue, regardless of the size and scale. And I guess there's a little bit of nuance even to that, but I guess the point is it's risk exposure and has to be mitigated and first has to be understood.
Because even these small things will add up. If you think about it, you look at one visit and then you multiply that by how many times you've done that in a year, it's going to add up very, very quickly.
And even like you said, there's kind of the office aspect to this, the office billing. There's the, if it does involve a ED or ER scenario, and other specialties I know have different are impacted differently as well. So yeah, there's a lot there. One of the things, Alex, going a little bit back to the compensation discussion that you were talking about, you alluded earlier to the changes, or maybe Matt, you talked about this in the conversion factor. I do want to point that out real quick. And I think most of the folks listening to this discussion are going to be familiar with what we're talking about in terms of what's the conversion factor, what does that mean? But maybe if you don't mind, Matt, give us a real quick description of when we're talking about the conversion factor, what that means. And then once you do that, I'd love to hear how some of those changes or some of the changes coming in impacting the conversion factor can be handled by like the organizations we work with when they may need to adjust that conversion factor with different physician comp plans, or maybe there's other adjustments they can make in order to account for those changes in the conversion factor. Maybe that's my question, but yeah, if you don't mind articulating that real briefly, I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah, sure. So this really goes back to how Medicare reimburses for physician services. So every single visit or procedure that a physician provides to a patient, there's the CPT code that goes along with that. That is comprised of work RVUs, practice expense RVUs, and malpractice RVUs. So every code has a set of RVUs associated with it. And then each year, Medicare puts out a conversion factor, which converts those RVUs into dollars of reimbursement. So this year, for example, the conversion factor, because CMS has budget neutrality rules that they have to abide by, and with the existing changes to the outpatient E&Ms still out there, we haven't fully realized the decrease in the conversion factor from that still. Plus all the changes that they're doing this year, the conversion factor was set to go down 4.5% this year. Now it took an act of Congress. They changed the conversion factor last minute. So it's going to be now a 2.5% decrease from last year, but it's still a decrease to the conversion factor. So for many of the CPT codes that physicians are billing out there, same level of service last year is now going to be reimbursed lower by Medicare.
So basically, we're talking about, to really oversimplify it, is reimbursement per unit of measurement, reimbursement per RVU. That just happens to be the unit of measurement. And tying this back to the physician comp planning, there is the conversion factor in most of these RVU based comp plans where, there will be a conversion factor set of, this is your reimbursement per unit per RVU. This is how we're going to calculate your compensation for those different procedures. How do these organizations start accounting for that? If it's a 2 to 3% decrease, or if there wasn't any intervention, a 4 to 5% decrease, who knows what the future holds as far as those conversion factors? Is that something that drills all the way down to this individual provider's compensation and the formulas for calculating it? Do those need to be adjusted, or is there another way to kind of incorporate this so that we can account for all of the compliance things that Jaci works on, and she talked about some of those, but there's also the financial impact over here that, again, that Alex talked about, and affects both top line revenue for the organization as a whole, but all the way trickles down all the way to the individual provider compensation. How should they start looking at that and accounting for the impact of these changes?
Yeah, that's right. It can impact the physician at the individual physician level, but moreover, the organizations, if they are seeing a reduction in reimbursement but keeping physician compensation flat or even increasing, that money's got to come from somewhere. So Alex, I know you talk a lot about this with clients on setting strategy, comp plan strategies for the future. Do you want to speak to what you often tell clients there?
Yeah, I think there is a lot on physician plates, and to try to ask them to understand and make updates for all of these changes is ridiculous. And that's one reason why we're seeing more and more physicians move towards hospital-based employment, because you get some support from administrators And those administrators need to do some things to help the physicians do what they went to medical school to do, practice medicine. So that means helping quantify the impact this may have from an organizational perspective, from a physician perspective, and coming up with some of those mitigation strategies. The calculator that we've put out, it's one example where we've tried to create some tools to help organizations be thinking through this. But essentially, we've got a whole bunch of thought leadership that we've worked with organizations implement on what these new strategies look like that differ organization by organization. And I think where CMS policy meets practice operations, that's where we often want to support our clients coming up with the tailored recommendation that they can deploy to go maximize their resources and get the most out of this reimbursement.
Mm-hmm. So I want to bring this kind of full circle. And Jaci, I'll ask you, but whoever wants to jump in, feel free. What are we talking with clients about right now in terms of timing? I know some of the stuff I've read kind of says this year is going to be sort of a preparation year. I think they even talked about it last year that there would be some sort of buffer time frame, whether that was 2022 or 23, or I think sometimes that's a little vague, when it's coming from the federal government, but or maybe it's not. Maybe should they look at this retroactively and some of the changes there? I know the obvious answer is they want to get in front of it as much as possible, as early as possible. But to Alex's point, there is a lot here, and the larger the organization, the more that they do in terms of procedures and services and billing. Obviously, they got to account for changes in a number of different areas and in different ways. So, what are we looking at or talking to clients about in terms of the timing of all this?
Well, it hit CPT. It was released January 1st, 2023. So we're in it. There was no so-called grace period like we had with some policies and changes in the past years. There's no grace period. The new guidelines and how these codes are used went into effect January 1st. So at this point, it is, and you're right, physicians, providers have a lot on their plate. There's a lot to think about. And I think where they can just begin to grasp some of these changes, again, if providers who are going out to the hospital spend a considerable amount of their time in their office, they understand what they've already had since 2021 to start to understand this. It's more your hospitalists, your ED providers that are heavily based in the hospital are going to need to start grouping together and discussing this as a group and get on the same page, get that audit done so that you can put some fair numbers into your calculator and really start knowing where you're going. Because we've addressed, how these RVUs are going to hit, as well as the change in the conversion factor. All of these play into it. But at the end of the day, as you mentioned before, if your documentation is not there and you think you did a service, however, it doesn't meet it doesn't matter anymore. So
right.
It's getting a handle on where you're at right now and where do you need to tweak this and where do you need to get the education so you can put good, solid numbers into your calculator and have a good, fair perspective of where you're going.
And just one quick caveat. I know that the guidelines, they are now in effect. Mm-hmm. But one thing that CMS qualified is that how they measure, one of the major changes that's taking place is in the facility setting, the provider that performs the substantial amount of service is going to be able to bill and be credited for that service. That the guideline is now changed, but CMS is going to begin actually measuring that, define that substantial portion of service on January 1st, 2024.
Right. And that's for your non-physician providers, not your residents or your fellows, or I don't even like to say students, but students. That's for your non-physician providers, correct. So this is their year to prepare on proper documentation and getting that measurement. So come 2024, they'll be ready to implement the new rules and how they'll be seen. But The teaching physician rules are totally separate, and they hold.
So in 23, physicians can still build on medical decision making, but in 24, it will begin to be based on the provider that performed the substantive service.
Right.
I'll also mention, we're talking primarily about the changes in the E&M codes here today, but every year they do change other codes. For example, this year they've completely restructured how hernia repair is being looked at, for example. So while we're talking primarily about the E&M code changes, every year there's something that changes, and so it's a topic that you should really be thinking about at least annually about what changes are going to be occurring in the next year.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. You kind of brought it around for me, Matt. But in terms of what we do in advising and assisting our clients, one of those things is developing, compiling compensation strategy. And, in the past, I think a lot of organizations have looked at that as maybe not a one-time thing, but it's kind of a big exercise you go through. And once you have those models and that strategy down, that's going to last for at least a while. I think now the way some of these changes have been coming down the last few years, and I think it's pretty widely accepted that we're going to continue to see fairly substantive changes in future years. Planning out comp strategy is becoming more and more complex, and it is not just kind of one and done type exercise. I think we're going to see this start to be more of an ongoing rolling process that has to be evaluated. And, Jackie, you talked about on the compliance and the coding side of things, audits, right? That's the way for years that we've helped clients make sure everything is buttoned up from a compliance perspective. Any changes or education that needs to occur goes a long way, but those are obviously not one and done things. Those are very regular occurrences and have to be updated. Some organizations do it annually, some do it maybe every couple of years, some do it quite frequently. But I guess, and maybe Alex, you can comment on this, but do you think we're going to start seeing that mindset start to shift when it comes to the comp strategy and the comp modeling side of things, meaning it's not kind of a set in stone thing, but it's a little bit more of an ongoing evolution? Or how do you think the future will look for organizations trying to adjust for these changes?
I don't know that I would. When I think about a compensation strategy, I don't know that my goal would be to have it be reactive to market forces whenever something comes up. Yet it needs to be flexible and nimble enough to withstand those market forces. And so I still go back to a sound compensation strategy. Is it aligned with your overall objectives? Are you incentivizing physicians to meet those aligned priorities and objectives? And if so, then you can review the compensation structure on a regular cadence to make sure that it's keeping up with those external forces.
So it's not necessarily massive changes ongoing, but adjustments to an already dynamic plan.
I think you need to, on a regular basis, understand how is your compensation plan meeting these challenges. But I don't know that I would have overhauls because of every change that occurs in the marketplace. That's not the how you want to set up your compensation.
Yeah, well, that's a topic in and of itself, obviously. And again, I think that's helpful bringing it full circle here, because this is one of those topics. This is probably the topic where we get the most questions and engagement with a lot of our clients, because it does affect them so broadly. And it entails a lot of the work that we do, whether it's, again, on the compliance side or financial side of things. And this is going to be something that, just as we've been talking about it pretty consistently in the last few years, but I know this is something that we're going to have to continue to provide updates on and additional commentary as more develops in some of these things going on. So I say that to kind of set the stage a little bit and remind folks to continue to follow us as we follow this topic and can provide updates. But again, as I said earlier, if there are questions right now that we need that need to be answered, I want to make sure we're on top of those for our clients and others out there having to deal with some of these challenges. And whether it's starting with the audit side of things with Jaci, or if it's taking a different kind of perspective of analysis on the financial side or the physician comp side, again, that's all kind of very, very regular, normal stuff that we work with our clients on. So I really invite folks to ask you all any questions, bring any questions they may have to you all. But otherwise, I know we'll talk about this. We'll follow up on this topic here in the near future and continue the discussion. But in the meantime, I appreciate you guys coming on, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion down the road.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
A lot of fun.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes. The information presented and discussed in the Coffee with Coker podcast is intended strictly for informational purposes only. Listeners are solely responsible for employing their own research methods when weighing, valuing, and considering the information and recommendations provided by Coker. The content included in the Coffee with Coker podcast should not be treated as financial or investment advice. The information presented in this podcast is not legal advice, nor should you rely on the recommendations contained herein as a legal opinion. All information contained in this podcast is considered current as of the date of the recording of this material, but laws, regulations, and payer requirements are subject to change, and Coker has no responsibility to update this podcast to reflect any such changes after the date this podcast was recorded.